Good evening. I'm the MadCatster, and I don't know if I'm glad to see you or if you'll be glad to see me when our tale is done. My devilish sidekick, Sybil, is going to be with us this evening on our journey as we head back to Salem, Massachusetts in the year 1830 for a crime so heinous that it made headlines across this country. And I'm going to tell you all about it right now. So let's get into it. I'm here tonight with Sybil, the enforcer, who says, please like and subscribe, or she'll haunt you for all the rest of your days. Tonight we're going to embark on a journey back in time to old Salem, Massachusetts, and to a story that will cause you more fright than a day out with the Ace family. And we're going to revisit some of the sites that I mentioned in this story, and any footage you see that is not stock footage is my actual visit to the actual scene of the crime and to some of the other places that I'll mention. So, my friends, Halloween evening, I know I'm a little late, but I did have trick-or-treaters, and this cobweb mess behind me with the spider looked a lot better when I stuck it up this afternoon on my door to greet children. And I had a witch, and I had pumpkin lights, and I had this lantern that's flickering in front of me. And I was wearing this very outfit, and we did pretty well tonight. It's the first time actually I've decorated, believe it or not, for Halloween. So let's get to our story. So picture it. Sicily, 1925. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's a whole different story. And those of you who get that reference, leave me a comment down below. But we're going to go back to Salem in 1830, and we're going to a tale as old as time, a song as old as rhyme, and no, it's not Beauty and the Beast. It's murder, and murder for greed. That's the tale as old as time. So, back in 1830 in Salem, Massachusetts, Salem at that time was a very busy trade port. It was a very busy port, actually, even though it's quite peaceful today, with a lot of trade to the Far East and goods coming in and out, and it made fortunes for a number of families whose names are still known in Salem today. One of them, who is not remembered because of his great deeds or his beneficence or his benevolence or even his kind heart, is Captain Joseph White. And he is remembered primarily for having his head bashed in, all by somebody ultimately who was in search of the captain's fortune. So, Captain White, he was not a very well-loved person, to say the least, in Salem. He was known to be quite disagreeable. He was known to be a tyrant. He had no children and was not married, and had some of his family members working in his household, and his grand house still stands today. It's actually a museum today, but it's still there. It's a very fine house. Even today, it's a very fine house. And he was known for using his fortune to play and manipulate his family members, and kept them guessing at who would inherit upon his demise, and changed his will at the drop of a hat, it's said. So Captain White was a childless widower of the age of 82, which was a fairly old age back then. And he had several servants in his household. One of them was his niece, Mrs. Beckford, who served as his housekeeper. He had another girl who was not a relative, who was a servant, probably like a scullery maid or cook or who knows what. And then his distant relative, Benjamin White, who served as a handyman on the property. Now, Mrs. Beckford's daughter had also once been employed in the household. However, being Captain White's grandniece, she fell victim to his ploys with his will changing and threats. She decided to marry a man named Joseph Jenkins Knapp. And when she did this without Captain White's consent, he promptly and predictably cut her out of his will. So she went off to live on a farm, and things went on as usual. Then, on the evening of April 6th, 1830, a lone assailant crept silently down the streets of Salem, made his way to Captain White's house on Essex Street, went toward the back of the house, climbed into an unlocked window on the side of the house where there was a plank conveniently propped for him to use because the windows are fairly high, and you'll see that in the pictures here, and silently made his way up the stairs. He knew exactly where he was going, and he went directly to Captain White's bedroom. The old man was probably sound asleep when the assailant entered his room, and before Captain White even would have had time to stir, violently struck him over the head with a bludgeon, and then proceeded to stab the old man, leaving him dead and bleeding in his bed. He then left the premises, and the following morning, when his niece went up to check on him because he had not gotten up, and they noticed the window on the lower level was still left open. So she went up to check to see if everything was okay because they feared a burglar may have gotten in, and it was known that Captain White kept gold doubloons and other valuables in an iron chest in his bedroom. And so that was the first thought on the minds of the servants that morning. And when the niece made her way up to Captain White's bedroom, the door was open and she found him dead in his bed, blood everywhere. So at that time, there was no organized police department. So they called for one of Captain White's relatives who happened to be in the Massachusetts legislature. And he put out the word and had a doctor come to take a look at Captain White and to determine the cause of death. And it was quite obvious that this was a homicide. And they checked and nothing was missing, surprisingly. But what they didn't know was that just the week before, I believe it was, someone had gone into Captain White's bedroom, into that chest, didn't take any of the valuables, but rather took what appeared to be Captain White's last will and testament and took it and destroyed it. Now you may ask yourself, who or what would be the reason for someone doing this? Well, this person mistakenly thought that if they destroyed the will, that Captain White would die what we call intestate, and that his estate would be evenly divided amongst his surviving relatives. However, what this fool didn't realize was that Captain White's actual original will copy was in the vault at his attorney's office. I think you're getting the picture here that the motivation certainly wasn't the valuables in the house, but the motivation was the captain's sizable fortune. A coroner's inquest was held where there's a basically like a jury, and they determine based on the facts that are presented what the cause of death may be in terms of whether it was natural or it was unnatural. And in this case, they certainly determined it was murder. And then, of course, the captain was subjected to a further autopsy and determined that it was probably the blow to his head that actually had killed him, and that the stab wounds were insurance blows that weren't even necessary. But panic went through Salem because everyone thought there was a madman on the loose. And a committee of vigilance was put together. And basically, because there was no police force, citizens were gathered together who were basically deputized and had the authority to go search out to find any evidence or witnesses. There are any number of the captain's relatives who could be responsible. And within about a week, a letter arrived from New Bedford, Massachusetts, from the jail there, informing the Committee of Vigilance that one of their prisoners had been in a gambling establishment several weeks prior to the murder and overheard two brothers from Salem, Richard and George Crowninshield. Now, funnily enough, the Crowninshields were also a very wealthy, prominent family in Salem. The Crowninshield brothers, it was said, had been overheard saying they were going to steal Captain White's iron chest with its valuables in order, most likely, to pay off their gambling debts. So the Committee of Vigilance promptly set out and apprehended the Crowninshield brothers and locked them up in Salem's jail. And you'll see it here. It still stands today. It's been actually, after having been derelict for a long time, it was lovingly restored. And unfortunately, it's apartments now, but at least the building has been preserved, and you can see it right here. And the Crowninshield brothers were brought to the jail. Not long after the Crowninshield brothers were locked up in the Salem jail, Joseph Knapp Sr., the father of the man who had married Captain White's disinherited niece, received a strange letter from Maine from an anonymous gentleman who claimed that he had information that could be detrimental to Joseph Knapp Jr., Mr. Knapp's son, the one who had married the niece, and that if he didn't send him $350, that he was going to tell the authorities. So the letter was turned over to the Committee of Vigilance. The Committee of Vigilance decided, well, let's see if we can get this man and fish him out. So they sent $50 to the post office where this gentleman resided in Maine, and they posted somebody to keep watch. And sure enough, a man came to collect the money, and they proceeded to arrest him and question him. It turned out that this man, Mr. Palmer, had been at the house of the Crowninshields and had overheard a conversation between Joseph Knapp Jr., who was called Frank, and the Crowninshields, where Frank Knapp indicated that he wanted Captain White dead. So now you see where this is going, because it was his wife who was disinherited. So obviously, if Captain White were to die intestate, his wife would stand to inherit a portion of Captain White's fortune. So, of course, the Committee of Vigilance arrested Frank Knapp and his brother Joe, because it was said that Joe and Frank were in this together to have Captain White done away with. And the Knapp brothers were arrested. Well, once the Knapp brothers were arrested, the Crowninshields started to get nervous because they realized the story was starting to come together and that probably they'd be found out. Then, to confirm the Crowninshields' fears, Joe Knapp, the brother of Frank Knapp, who was the instigator of all of this, confessed. So Joe Knapp confessed to Reverend Henry Coleman, and Henry Coleman wrote down the 9-page confession, and then Joe Knapp signed it. So Joe, the brother of Frank, who was married to the grandniece, is actually the one who went to Captain White's house, went to the chest, and stole and destroyed the will. So now they had a confession, and the story was out. So it turned out that the Knapp brothers had asked the Crowninshields to get involved and to commit the murder, and that they would pay them. And so, of course, the Crowninshields, who actually were the black sheep of the Crowninshield family, and who had a reputation for not having very savory lifestyles, decided that they could use the money, and so agreed to commit the murder. And it was Richard Crowninshield who actually is the one who went into the house. So it turned out that Joe Knapp, Frank Knapp's brother, had actually been the one to leave the window unlocked so that Richard Crowninshield could gain access and murder Captain White. So the confession basically pointed to Richard Crowninshield as the murderer. And so Richard Crowninshield learned that in Massachusetts, accessories to the crime could not be tried and convicted unless the principal actor had first been tried and convicted. And so Believing that he was doing an altruistic deed, Richard Crowninshield hung himself in his cell. The Committee of Vigilance, not to be deterred that their main actor had now been taken out of the equation, hired Daniel Webster, who is, if you've not heard of him, a very famous attorney from back at that time. And in fact, there's a highway in New Hampshire named after him, and I think there's a college named after him. And he was, he had gotten prominence also later in Washington, but he was known to be, one of the best. So it took some persuasion, but Daniel Webster agreed to come to Salem to act as the prosecuting attorney. And he was determined and hell-bent that he was going to get the accomplices to this crime. So Daniel Webster determined that he was going to try Frank Knapp, and he was going to try to convict him as a principal actor rather than as an accessory, since he is the one who was the mastermind of the whole conspiracy. So during the trial, a witness had claimed that they had seen Frank Knapp on the street behind Captain White's house that night, but the defense attorney was successful in discrediting the witness. Long story short, the first trial ended up with a hung jury, and they were deadlocked. And so a second trial had to be held. Now, between the two trials, the jury, because back then they didn't sequester juries. Juries generally came from the immediate community. They didn't generally move trials like they do today. And of course, people in the community had been exposed to all of the news and the sort of details about the confession and the crime. And so when the second trial commenced, the jury, let's say, was a little prejudiced. So Daniel Webster gave what is considered to be a masterful summation, and Frank Knapp was convicted. And they convicted him of murder as a principal instead of an accessory. And Frank Knapp was shortly thereafter hung. Then his brother Joseph went on trial, and he too, amazingly, was convicted as a primary actor. And he also was convicted and also was hung. Now, George Crowninshield, Richard Crownishield's brother, ultimately was acquitted of charges. Although he certainly wasn't viewed as not guilty by the community, he was found not guilty, and so they were not able to get him convicted the same way as the Knapp brothers. So he's the only one that survived the whole ordeal. Unfortunately, as I've said before, Captain White had another will, had an original will on file with his attorney, as a lot of people do, and that will did not leave any substantial part of the fortune to Mrs. Beckford or her daughter. And so it seems that the crime, unfortunately and sadly, was really for nothing. And it's sad that, even though Captain White was not a loved man, it's still a terrible thing that happened to him. And 3 other people lost their lives as well because they were part of the crime. And so it's a really tragic tale. And so Daniel Webster certainly earned his fee because he got 2 of the remaining 3 people convicted and executed. And his reputation was basically cemented. And he went on to have an illustrious rest of his career, but ultimately died of cirrhosis of the liver and a brain hemorrhage. So he apparently was a heavy drinker. But that's our tale. And here you're going to see now the cemetery where Captain White is buried. And unfortunately, his grave is not marked. However, there is a White family vault that I saw that you'll see here. Ironically, the old cemetery where Captain White was buried is right next to the old Salem jail. So that's our tale, my friends. And I hope you enjoyed it. The only thing I wish I had taken the videos at night, because I didn't really think about it at the time. But of course, the crime happened at night. It probably would have given a little bit more of an aura. But anyways, you do see the actual sites where I went. You can see, you can see Captain White's bedroom, which is on the 2nd floor on the left-hand corner of the house, which if you're in Europe, it's the 1st floor. On the left-hand corner, it's basically the middle floor. And so, that the room's still there. You can tour it. Unfortunately, when I was there. There were no tours going. They're still not really back up to full schedule. So I didn't get to go in the house, which I really wanted to do, but I did obviously went to the outside, and you can see like where the murderer went into the house and where Captain White's bedroom was upstairs, and the jail and the cemetery. They also, in the Peabody Essex Museum, which is a big museum in Salem, and actually it's known internationally, in their archives they actually have the actual murder weapon, and you can go and you can actually see it. They have all the original court documents, handwritten notes by the attorneys. They've got all kinds of other evidence there, and it was really fascinating to go through. Thank you on this Halloween evening for joining me. My faithful sidekick has decided that the story was too frightening for her and she's gone to bed. But you guys, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to all our supporters. But thank you, everyone, for being here. Please take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.
Pretty please. Subscribe, like, and hit the bell. I get a treat for every new sub. Thank you.